As inexplicable as it is, just like most of the staff at Outer Heaven who survived 2 explosions, Big Boss managed a dozen and seems perfectly fine. Snake's Revenge did the Big Boss revival better by making him basically 90% robot, yet here stands the canonical eyepatch man, completely healthy despite being filled with more lead than a nuclear warhead. The flaw of this fight is that it completely recontextualizes Solid Snake's reason for getting involved being his fears that another Metal Gear would have been built, and it reignited his nightmares. He didn't go into Operation F-14 just because he's this famous mercenary, but due to his personal feelings about the Outer Heaven incident, and like I said in the Snake's Revenge video, Solid Snake doesn't have any personal attachment to anything in his life. He lets it all go with the flow because he understands that things change and adapt to the present and life's unpredictable, which is probably the reason that Holly gets snubbed at the end of the game, spoiler alert. Big Boss didn't solely start running Zanzibar land for revenge on Solid Snake like wherever the hell we are, Bill, but instead he was doing what he did when running Mother Base. Big Boss realized that mercenaries knew nothing other than the battlefield, that politicians didn't need them around until they needed them to fight, that even though the mercenaries had ties with these countries, they truly had no home to go back to, and so he created Mother Base in Zanzibar land to be the country that cared for their well-being, which explains all the carryover characters, the infinite amount of soldiers walking around, and the kids. They're children of war, and it still works canonically because Ahab was brainwashed to inhabit this idea carried over from the real Big Boss. The story surrounding this fight is near rock solid with Metal Gear's traditional anti-war messages, and the fight itself is pretty damn good. Instead of it being the usual face-off from Metal Gear or Snake's Revenge, this fight starts with Solid Snake needing to mostly hide from Big Boss because he had to chuck all his gear after Metal Gear D exploded and immolated his head. Luckily for Solid Snake, he's fighting Big Boss in a storage shed filled with his old key cards. How convenient! So Solid Snake has to puzzle out which doors go with which keys while Big Boss is chasing and shooting at him, so that's frantic enough being unequipped completely. But there's also sulfuric acid all over the place, which is neutralized by rations, of which the fight gives you 3 only, so you have to balance out maintaining your health or removing more instant death puddles. I know sulfuric acid is pretty potent, but I'm sure there's not an acid around that can melt a human in 15 seconds. That's one thing that ticked me off slightly. And then after you figure out the whole thing and avoid being melted several times, you can take on Big Boss by employing a spray can flamethrower. Then the fight rolls over and lets you kick it to pieces because covered combat is its entire undoing for the same reason that Jungle Evils was. Yet, for a great narrative around the fight that told us about Big Boss's character and used a simple puzzle to increase the tension before finally paying it off with a ridiculous final weapon MacGyvered out of random stuff, it ends up being one of the great final boss examples of which gaming needs to learn more from. Cough, cough, Liquid Snake.